Sundance Film Festival 2026 is underway, and I spoke with Nigerian film critic Seyi Lasisi, who is not new to covering the festival, about African films in this year's selection. Let's get into it.
Hello, AJ. It's wonderful connecting with you again to discuss about African films, specifically African films at Sundance 2026. And I'm just excited about this conversation. So, for your first question, we have a total of six films with a sort of like African focus at Sundance this year. We have three feature-length films and three short films. And for the three feature-length films, we have one that is somewhat of an homage to Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. Then we have Olive Nwosu's Lady from Nigeria. Then we have Kikuyu Land. Then for the shorts, you are from Tunisia. You also have like two other films that aren't specifically what the only affiliation they have with Africa is because they are African theme inclined, but the production companies are not necessarily African based. So, but their only claim to being African titles is because the directors are like Africans, and it's such an interesting. This is such an like interesting distinction to make because I think sometime last year, Akoroko Tambio Benson did a sort of like report where he tracked African representation at Sundance over the years. And what he discovered was that over the years from 2021 to 2024, you have about like 38 films. And it also like some of like the distinction Thambi also was able to find with his research was that some of like these 38 African stories, the directors aren't necessarily African or of African descent, but some of like the subject matter they treated are like African inclined. So their affiliations to being African films, maybe from like a production point of view, might not be established, but from a subject level, director level, could be African. So it's such like an interesting realization. For like the second question, it's still somewhat related to like the first question because over the years, I think Akurukud like did that very beautiful report where you see that like over the years, African titles at the festival have been like very minimal. So I would say it's not necessarily that. So I would still say they are a little bit on the margins because again, you ask yourself the question of how many African films has gotten award, how many African films has been on like Sundance major competition category, and you also ask yourself the question of what are the aftermaths of these African films that are screened at Sundance, what sort of trackable achievement have they been able to achieve? What sort of like distribution deals have these films been able to get, and how has it also sort of like launched the careers of like these African directors as opposed to other non-African directors or filmmakers? So those are like the sub to question that is your question also sort of like raises. So like yeah, on the surface we might be having, oh, we have XYZ number of African filmmakers selected for this festival this year, but from like an industry point of view or from like an individual filmmaker point of view, what sort of trackable achievements could we link that, oh, this filmmakers films got selected to this festival, and how does that impact their career? From what I've observed, some of like the recurring theme is also that theme around stories of horror, politics, revolution, identity. And it's actually not out of place in a way because, and again, I'm going to like rephrase that. It's actually first, it's not out of place to have African filmmakers or African films dealing directly with topical, like political, economic, and social issues, because that is the reality on ground. Take for instance, Olive Wonsu's directorial debut, Lady. It is a film that deals directly with certain like economical and political issues within the context of like the Nigerian society. And over the years too, you've seen like African films being boxed to want to address political issues. And there is also an argument for Africans are also like happy, Africans are also funny. So why aren't we seeing African comedies, African rom-coms selected at this major festival? Why is it that most of the films that gets made, that get selected for these festivals, are always expected to be under a particular thematic focus, maybe politics, maybe social issues? So it's also like another larger conversation to have. I might have not have like thought about this more in depthly, but I think we need to improve the African film system, like film industry. And by this, I mean a sort of Africa where funding opportunities are on the continent. Because again, if you check some of like these African titles that that made it to like these international festivals, in terms of ownership from like a production standpoint, they aren't African films, right? They are mostly like funded by like European companies, European grants, European cultural institutions. And what that means is that like the claim of ownership to these films aren't by Africans. And to some extent, the financiers also like control a couple of things when it comes to artistic direction, when it comes to like directorial direction. So I think if we sort of like have a an African ecosystem where funding opportunities exist on the continent for filmmakers to make films, I think in a way it might shift the sort of like stories we tell. And it might also mean that we have, it might not be equal as of now, but it's sort of quote unquote like equal playing ground in terms of like deciding on the kind of like stories we want to tell. AJ, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about Sundance 2026, and the festival is still ongoing. It has been like an interesting coverage so far.